The jaguar walked towards her until an Apache warrior saved her. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Dr. Sarah Martinez as she adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and checked her GPS device for the third time in 10 minutes. The coordinates she'd been given led her deeper into the Sonoran Desert, far from any established trail or research station. As a wildlife biologist specializing in endangered species migration patterns, she'd traveled to remote locations before. But something about this assignment felt different. Her boots crunched against the gravelly desert floor as she navigated. Between towering saguaro cacti and scattered creosote bushes, the landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in muted browns and greens under the harsh afternoon light. She'd been hired by the Nature Conservancy to investigate reports of unusual jaguar sightings in this region, a phenomenon that shouldn't exist this far north. Sarah paused to wipe sweat from her forehead, her water bottle already half empty despite starting her trek just 2 hours ago. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of a lizard or the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. She'd grown up in Phoenix, but even she found the desert's vastness intimidating when alone. Her phone had lost signal miles ago, leaving her dependent on the GPS unit and her own navigation skills. The research station where she was supposed to meet her guide remained another 3 miles ahead, according to her calculations. Dr. Williams from the University of Arizona had assured her that Jake Running Bear, a local Apache guide with extensive knowledge of the area, would meet her there by sunset. As she climbed a small rise, Sarah spotted something unusual in the distance: fresh tire tracks leading off the main path toward a cluster of mesquite trees. Her curiosity piqued, she decided, to investigate. The tracks were recent, maybe a day old, and led to what appeared to be an abandoned campsite. Empty water bottles and food containers were scattered around a cold fire pit, but what caught her attention were the large paw prints in the soft sand. Nearby, her heart raced as she knelt to examine them more closely. The prints were unmistakably feline, far too large for a mountain lion, with the distinctive shape she'd studied countless times in textbooks and research papers. Panthera onca, she whispered to herself, using the scientific name for jaguar. The prints were fresh, maybe hours old, and headed southeast toward the mountains. Sarah quickly pulled out her camera and notebook, documenting the size, depth, and direction of the tracks. This could be the breakthrough that proved jaguars were indeed returning to their historical range in Arizona. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah realized she needed to reach the research station before dark, but the jaguar tracks pulled at her scientific instincts. She'd dedicated her career to understanding these magnificent predators, and here was evidence of their presence in an area where they hadn't been seen in decades. Making a quick decision, she decided to follow the tracks for just a short distance, marking her path with small cairns of stacked stones so she could find her way back. The trail led her through a narrow wash between 2 low hills, where the vegetation grew thicker and provided welcome shade from the still intense sun. As she rounded a bend in the wash, Sarah froze. About 50 yards ahead, partially hidden by a large boulder and some desert willow trees, she could see movement. Her binoculars confirmed her suspicions. It was indeed a jaguar, a magnificent adult female, drinking from a small spring that bubbled up from between the rocks. The cat was even more beautiful than Sarah had imagined, its golden coat marked with distinctive black rosettes, muscles rippling beneath its fur as it moved. She held her breath, afraid any sound might spook the animal, and slowly reached for her camera. This was the documentation she needed to prove the jaguars had returned. But as she adjusted her position for a better angle, her foot dislodged a small rock that clattered down the wash. The jaguar's head snapped up, yellow eyes locking onto Sarah's position with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The jaguar stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, its powerful gaze fixed on Sarah's hiding spot behind a cluster of prickly pear cacti. Every instinct told her to remain perfectly still, but her heart hammered so loudly she was certain the cat could hear it. The animal was larger than she'd expected, easily 150 pounds of pure muscle and predatory grace. Sarah had studied jaguar behavior extensively, knew that attacks on humans were extremely rare, but she also understood that this was a wild animal, in its territory, potentially protecting a water source crucial for survival in the harsh desert environment. The cat's ears were forward, alert, but not flattened in aggression. Its tail twitched slightly, a sign that it was processing the situation, deciding whether she represented a threat. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the jaguar began to move. Not away, as Sarah had hoped, but toward her position. Each step was deliberate, calculated, paws placing silently on the rocky ground. The cat's muscles coiled and released with fluid precision, embodying millions of years of evolutionary perfection. Sarah's mouth went dry as she realized her predicament. She couldn't run. Jaguars could reach speeds of up to 50 miles per hour in short bursts, and their powerful jaws could crush bone with over 2,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Her only option was to remain calm, avoid direct eye contact, and slowly back away while making herself appear as large and non-threatening as possible. But as she began to rise from her crouched position, the jaguar suddenly froze, its attention shifting to something behind and above Sarah. The cat's ears swiveled, picking up sounds that human hearing couldn't detect. A low, almost inaudible growl rumbled from its throat, but the sound wasn't directed at her. Sarah risked a glance over her shoulder and felt her breath catch. On the ridge above the wash, silhouetted against the deepening sky, stood a figure she hadn't heard approach. A tall man, lean and weathered, with long black hair tied back and wearing worn jeans and a faded denim shirt. His presence was so still, so integrated with the landscape, that he seemed to have materialized from the desert itself. The man's dark eyes moved between Sarah and the jaguar with calm assessment. In his hands he held not a weapon, but a small leather pouch and what appeared to be a carved wooden flute. His movements were deliberate, respectful, as he slowly descended into the wash, positioning himself between Sarah and the big cat. "Don't move," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of Apache heritage. "She's not hunting. She's protecting her cubs." Sarah's scientific mind immediately understood the implications. A female jaguar with cubs was exponentially more dangerous than a solitary animal. The maternal instinct to protect offspring could override the cat's natural avoidance of humans. She watched in fascination and terror as the man, who she assumed must be Jake Running Bear, her scheduled guide, began to make soft, rhythmic sounds. The sounds weren't quite singing, weren't quite speaking, but something in between. Ancient. Words in a language Sarah didn't recognize flowed from his lips, accompanied by gentle movements of his hands. The jaguar's posture began to change subtly. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained fixed on the humans. Jake continued his quiet vocalizations, occasionally raising the wooden flute to his lips to produce haunting, breathy notes that seemed to blend with the desert wind. The melody was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, wild and primal, yet somehow peaceful. The jaguar's tail stopped twitching, and she sat back on her haunches, though still alert. "My grandmother taught me that all creatures have their own songs," Jake whispered to Sarah without turning around. "You just have to know how to listen and how to answer." Minutes passed in this strange standoff. Man and jaguar engaged in some form of communication that transcended Sarah's scientific understanding. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, even the ever-present insect buzz fading to silence. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. Gradually, the jaguar rose to her feet and, with a final long look at the two humans, turned and padded silently back toward the spring. She drank briefly, then disappeared into the gathering shadows between the rocks, presumably returning to wherever her cubs waited. Jake lowered his flute and turned to face Sarah, his weathered face creased with concern. "Dr. Martinez, I presume. You're a long way from the research station, and this isn't the safest place to be alone, especially not with a mother jaguar around." Sarah found her voice, though it came out shakier than she intended. "How did you do that? How did you know she had cubs, and how did you find me?" "Years of living in this desert," Jake replied simply. "And you left a trail a blind man could follow. Those cairns you built were visible from miles away." He gestured toward her stone markers. "As for the cubs, it's the only reason she would approach instead of flee. Mothers protect their young, whether they're human, jaguar, or anything else." The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Sarah looked toward the spring where the jaguar had vanished, then back at Jake, whose calm presence had quite possibly saved her life. The research station turned out to be a modest collection of weathered buildings nestled against a rocky outcropping, solar panels glinting on the roofs in the last light of day. Jake led Sarah there as darkness settled over the desert, their path illuminated by a surprisingly bright canopy of stars. She'd grown accustomed to Phoenix's light pollution, and the clarity of the night sky out here took her breath away. "My great-grandfather built the original structure here in the 1940s, Jake explained as they approached the main building. "The university leases it from our tribal council now, but we still maintain it. It's one of the few places where researchers and traditional knowledge keepers can work together." Inside, the station was functional but comfortable, with modern scientific equipment sharing space with hand-woven rugs and carved wooden artifacts. Jake started a propane lantern while Sarah set down her pack and tried to process the day's events. Her hands were still shaking slightly from the encounter with the jaguar. "You should eat something," Jake suggested, pulling supplies from a well-stocked kitchen area. "Desert encounters tend to drain people, especially those not used to them. And we need to talk about why you're really here." As he prepared a simple meal of beans, fry bread, and coffee, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected savior. Jake appeared to be in his early 40s, with the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime spent outdoors. His movements were economical, purposeful, without wasted motion. Everything about him spoke of someone deeply connected to this harsh but beautiful landscape. "The Nature Conservancy hired me to investigate jaguar sightings," Sarah began, accepting a plate of food gratefully. "But I'm starting to think there's more to the story than I was told." Jake nodded slowly. "There usually is. The cats started showing up about 6 months ago. First just tracks, then sightings. The tribal elders weren't surprised, but the wildlife officials were skeptical. Jaguars haven't had an established population this far north in over 50 years. "But you've seen them before today?" "3 times, Jake confirmed. "Always near water sources, always moving through rather than settling. Except for this female. She's different. She's chosen to stay, to raise her cubs here. That tells us something important." Sarah leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her exhaustion. "What does it tell us?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Traditional Apache stories speak of the jaguar as a messenger, a bridge between the world of humans and the spirit world. When they return to places they've been absent from, it usually means the balance is shifting, that something needs attention." "You mean climate change? Habitat restoration? Maybe. Or maybe something more immediate." Jake's dark eyes met hers across the table. "There are plans to build a copper mining operation about 20 miles southeast of here. The environmental impact studies are still pending, but if it goes through, it would affect the entire watershed that feeds these springs." Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in her mind. So the jaguars aren't just returning randomly. They're responding to something. Changes in their traditional range, pressure from development, maybe even following prey species that are moving north due to climate shifts. "That's the scientific explanation," Jake agreed. "But there's another way to look at it. My grandmother always said that animals know things before we do. They feel changes in the earth, in the water, in the balance of life. When they show up, in places they haven't been, it's because they're trying to tell us something." The conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside, a low, coughing roar that echoed off the surrounding rocks. Both Sarah and Jake froze, listening intently. The call was answered by a softer vocalization from a different direction. "The female and her mate," Jake whispered. "He's been following at a distance, making sure she and the cubs are safe." They moved to the window, peering out into the starlit desert. Sarah could make out movement near the spring, two large shapes moving with that distinctive feline grace. Her heart raced with excitement rather than fear this time. She was witnessing something that few people would ever see: a family of jaguars reestablishing themselves in their ancestral territory. "How many people know about this?" she asked quietly. "Officially, just you, me, and a couple of tribal council members. Unofficially, word is starting to spread. Some of the ranchers are concerned about livestock, though jaguars rarely take cattle. The mining company has been asking questions about wildlife surveys in the area." Sarah understood the implications immediately. If word got out about a breeding population of jaguars before proper protections were in place, it could spell disaster for the cats. Poachers, curiosity seekers, or simply well-meaning but disruptive researchers could drive them away, or worse. "We need to document this properly," she said. "Get genetic samples, establish territory boundaries, assess prey availability. But it has to be done carefully, without disturbing them." Jake nodded approvingly. "That's why the tribal council requested you specifically. Dr. Williams spoke highly of your work with the Mexican jaguar populations. But this isn't just about science, Dr. Martinez. These cats are returning for a reason, and I think that reason has as much to do with the health of this entire ecosystem as it does with their own survival needs." Outside, the jaguar calls faded into the night, replaced by the normal sounds of the desert. Owls calling, coyotes yipping in the distance, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush. Sarah realized that for the first time in months, she felt truly energized about her work. This wasn't just another research project. It was a chance to be part of something historic. The return of one of North America's most magnificent predators to a landscape it had once called home. "So where do we start?" she asked. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "At dawn, I'll show you the territory they've established. But first, you need to understand something about working in Apache country. The land isn't just a resource to be studied. It's a living thing with its own rights and needs. If we're going to help these cats succeed, we need to think like they do, as part of the whole rather than separate from it." Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. Sarah woke to the sound of Jake moving quietly around the kitchen, the aroma of strong coffee already filling the air. She'd slept better than expected, despite the narrow cot and the night sounds of the desert filtering through the station's thin walls. "The cats are most active in the early morning and evening," Jake explained as they prepared for the day. "If we're going to track their territory without disturbing them, we need to move when they're resting." They set out as the sun crested the horizon, carrying GPS units, cameras, and sample collection equipment. Jake led them along paths that Sarah would never have noticed, game trails worn by generations of desert animals, following the natural contours of the land with minimal effort. "Your grandmother," Sarah asked as they walked, "was she a traditional healer?" Jake nodded. "Medicine woman, storyteller, keeper of plant knowledge. She taught me that every creature has its place in the web of life, including humans. But we've forgotten how to listen to the other voices." They stopped at a water source different from the spring where they'd encountered the female jaguar the previous day. This one was smaller, more hidden, tucked into a narrow canyon between red sandstone walls. The ground around it was crisscrossed, with tracks. Not just jaguars, but deer, javelinas, coyotes, and dozens of smaller species. "This is one of their regular stops," Jake observed, kneeling beside clear paw prints in the mud. "The male marks territory here." He pointed to Scratch, marks on a nearby tree, and the unmistakable scent marking that accompanied feline territorial behavior. Sarah began her documentation process, photographing and measuring tracks, collecting hair samples from where the cats had rubbed against rocks and trees. The genetic analysis would tell them crucial information about the jaguar's origins, whether they were part of the small Mexican population slowly expanding northward, or possibly descendants of cats that had survived undetected in the remote canyons of the borderlands. As they worked, Jake shared stories passed down through generations about the relationship between his people and the big cats. Jaguars were here long before horses, before cattle, before cities. The old songs speak of them as teachers, showing people how to move silently through the world, how to be patient hunters, how to respect the balance between taking and giving back. What happened to them? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the historical answer. Same thing that happened to many things: expansion, development, fear. By the 1960s, they were gone from Arizona, but the elders always said they would return when the time was right. They spent the morning mapping the jaguar's territory, which appeared to encompass roughly 15 square miles of desert and low mountains. The cats had chosen well. The area included multiple water sources, diverse prey habitat, and natural corridors that connected to larger wilderness areas to the south. Around midday, as they rested in the shade of a large boulder, Jake's expression grew serious. "There's something else you need to see, but it's not going to be easy to get to." He led her up a steep, narrow trail that wound between towering rock formations. Sarah's legs burned from the climb, and she had to stop frequently to catch her breath in the thin air. Jake moved ahead with the easy grace of someone who'd been navigating these paths since childhood. "This place is sacred to our people," he explained as they climbed. "Not many outsiders have seen it, but I think the jaguar's return is connected to what's here." They emerged onto a flat area high above the desert floor, surrounded by ancient rock walls covered in pictographs. Sarah gasped at the sight. Hundreds of images painted and carved into the red stone, depicting animals, human figures, and complex geometric patterns. Many of the animal figures were clearly jaguars, their distinctive spotted coats and powerful builds unmistakable, even in the stylized ancient art. "These paintings are over 1,000 years old," Jake said softly. "Maybe more. They show the relationship between our ancestors and all the creatures who shared this land. Look here." He pointed to a series of images that appeared to tell a story. Human figures and jaguars together, not in conflict, but in some form of cooperation or mutual respect. Other panels showed the cats near water sources, hunting, raising cubs. "It's a map," Sarah realized suddenly. "These pictographs are showing jaguar territory, their behavior patterns, their seasonal movements." Jake smiled. "My grandmother always said the ancestors left us instructions for how to live properly with the land. Maybe they knew the cats would come back someday, and we'd need to remember how to share space with them." As they studied the ancient artwork, Sarah became aware of a low, rumbling sound echoing off the canyon walls. Both she and Jake froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, and definitely feline. Moving carefully to the edge of the flat area, they peered down into the canyon below. There, on a narrow ledge about 50 feet down, lay the female jaguar with 2 cubs. The cubs appeared to be about 4 months old, their spotted coats already showing the distinctive rosette patterns of their species. They wrestled playfully, while their mother watched the surrounding area with the perpetual vigilance of a parent. "This is her den site," Jake whispered. "She's chosen to raise her cubs in the same place our ancestors painted pictures of her kind. That can't be coincidence." Sarah watched in amazement as the cubs tumbled and played, occasionally nursing when their games exhausted them. The mother cat seemed relaxed, comfortable in this protected space. It was the perfect denning location, elevated, defensible, with multiple escape routes and close proximity to water and prey. "We can't let anyone else know about this specific location," Sarah said firmly. "If researchers or photographers start coming here, it could force her to move the cubs before they're ready." "Agreed. But there's something else." Jake's voice carried a note of urgency. "The mining company's survey crews have been getting closer to this area. If they discover the pictographs, they'll want to study them. If they discover the den site..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood that they were racing against time. The jaguars had returned to their ancestral home. guided perhaps by instincts encoded in their genes, or by the same mysterious forces that had guided their ancestors to this place generations ago. But human activity threatened to disrupt this ancient connection before it could fully re-establish itself. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Hard to say. The environmental impact assessment for the mining project is supposed to be completed within 6 weeks. If we can document a breeding population of jaguars in the area, it might be enough to stop the project, or at least modify it significantly." Below them, the female jaguar rose and stretched, then began moving her cubs deeper into the canyon system. Sarah realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the return of a species, but the continuation of a relationship between land, animals, and people that stretched back across centuries. "We're going to need help," she said finally. "Official support, legal protection, maybe media attention at the right time. This is bigger than just a wildlife research project." Jake nodded. "I was hoping you'd see it that way. Because what happens here in the next few weeks could determine whether these cats have a future, or whether they disappear again for another 50 years. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the boardroom of the Nature Conservancy's Phoenix office, facing a panel of officials from various government agencies, environmental organizations, and representatives from the mining company. Her presentation, materials were spread across the table: photographs, genetic analysis results, territory maps, and prey density studies. Everything she documented painted a clear picture. A breeding population of jaguars had successfully re-established itself in southeastern Arizona. The genetic analysis confirms that these animals are part of the expanding Mexican population, Sarah explained, pointing to charts that showed DNA markers. The male appears to be from the Sierra Madre Occidental region, while the female carries genetic signatures consistent with cats from Sonora. This represents the northernmost breeding population documented in over 60 years. Dr. Williams from the University of Arizona nodded approvingly. The implications for ecosystem restoration are significant. Jaguars are an apex predator and a keystone species. Their presence indicates a healthy, functioning desert ecosystem. The mining company's representative, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Cole, leaned forward. "Dr. Martinez, your study covers only a 6-week period. How can you be certain this represents a permanent re-establishment rather than just transient individuals?" Sarah had expected this question. "The presence of cubs changes everything. The female has invested significant energy in selecting and defending a territory suitable for raising young. Jaguars typically den in the same area for 12 to 18 months while cubs mature. Additionally, we've documented scent marking behavior, territorial patrols, and established hunting patterns that indicate long-term residency." Jake, who'd been invited as a cultural consultant, spoke for the first time. "There's also traditional ecological knowledge to consider. Apache oral histories describe seasonal jaguar movements through this exact corridor. The cats aren't establishing new territory. They're reclaiming ancestral range." The representative from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Dr. Robert Chen, studied the territory maps carefully. The proposed mining area overlaps with approximately 30% of the documented jaguar territory, including 2 critical water sources. Even if the cats could adapt to some industrial activity, the noise, lights, and human presence during denning season would likely force them to relocate. "Relocate to where?" asked Maria Santos from the Arizona Game and Fish Department. "We're talking about suitable jaguar habitat, in a region where such habitat is extremely limited. If they're forced out of this territory, there's no guarantee they'd find anywhere else suitable for raising cubs." Patricia Cole pulled out her own set of documents. The mining operation would provide 300 permanent jobs and contribute $2.8 billion to the regional economy over its projected 15-year lifespan. "We're willing to discuss mitigation measures, but halting the project entirely seems disproportionate to the presence of 3 cats. 3 cats that represent the potential recovery of an entire species in the United States," Sarah countered. "And it's not just about the jaguars themselves. Their presence indicates that this ecosystem can support large predators, which means it's functioning at a level we haven't seen in decades. That has value beyond immediate economic considerations. The discussion continued for another 2 hours, with various agencies and organizations stating their positions. Sarah found herself thinking about the morning 3 days ago, when she and Jake had watched the cubs take their first tentative exploration outside the immediate den area, their mother trailing carefully behind. The sight of those young jaguars discovering their world had reinforced her conviction that some things were worth fighting for. Finally, Dr. Chen called for a brief recess. During the break, Jake approached Sarah in the hallway. "Whatever happens, in there," he said quietly. "You've already accomplished something important. People are paying attention. The story is getting out. That changes things, even if the immediate decision doesn't go our way." When the meeting reconvened, Dr. Chen announced the preliminary decision. Based on the evidence presented, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will be recommending that the area be designated as critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act. This doesn't automatically halt the mining project, but it does require extensive additional environmental review and mitigation planning. Patricia Cole's expression was carefully neutral. "We'll need to review this recommendation with our board of directors and legal team. However, I can say that Apex Mining has no interest in being responsible for the extinction of jaguars in the United States. We're open to discussing alternative sites or modified extraction methods." 3 months later, Sarah stood on the same ridge where she'd first encountered the jaguar, but this time she wasn't alone. A small group of researchers, photographers, and conservation officials watched from a respectful distance as the two cubs, now significantly larger and more confident, explored the canyon under their mother's watchful eye. The mining project had been relocated to a site 15 miles away, with part of the profits designated for a wildlife corridor fund. The jaguar territory had been officially designated as critical habitat, with a buffer zone that ensured protection for the cats and their prey base. Jake stood beside her, a satisfied smile on his weathered face. The grandmother would have been pleased, he said. The cats came back when they were needed most, just like the old song said they would. Sarah nodded, watching as one of the cubs pounced playfully at a butterfly. In the distance, she could see the male jaguar moving along, a familiar patrol route, his golden coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The sight never failed to take her breath away. "Dr. Martinez," one of the visiting researchers called out, "the trail cameras have captured images of what appears to be another adult female about 10 miles south of here. If that's confirmed, it would mean we have 2 breeding pairs in the area." Sarah finished, feeling a familiar surge of excitement, which would make this the most significant jaguar recovery in North American history. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in familiar shades of gold and amber, the research group began their trek back to the station. Sarah lingered for a moment, listening to the evening sounds of the desert coming to life. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the low, coughing call of a jaguar, not a sound of aggression or alarm, but the simple communication of a predator comfortable in its territory. The jaguars had come home, and in doing so, they'd reminded everyone who witnessed their return that some connections between land, animals, and people run deeper than economics or convenience. They speak to something fundamental about what it means to share a world, to recognize that survival, whether for jaguars, Apache people, or desert ecosystems, depends on understanding those connections and having the courage to protect them. As Sarah finally turned to follow the others back to the station, she heard Jake's voice, soft and reverent, singing one of his grandmother's songs. The melody drifted across the desert evening, mixing with the wind and the calls of nighthawks, becoming part of the ancient conversation between human and wild that had shaped this landscape for thousands of years and would continue long after they were gone.